Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back after lunch. My name is Robin Shepherd. I've been associated with the Halifax Forum for 7 years in a row, so it's a wonderful privilege to be back here again. It's also a privilege to welcome back General John Allen, Special Presidential Envoy for ISIL until very recently, and now at the Brookings Institution. As a number of people have said, this is the first major conference on security since Paris. I wanted to start off with a kind of very broad and general question, but maybe important. Has Paris, in your view, General Allen, made all the difference in terms of Western resolve to defeat Islamic State, Daesh? Or was the resolve there anyway? I mean, do you get a sense, are you detecting any change in the last few days, the last week or so?
The resolve was there to begin with. Tragedies like Paris and Canada, when the attacks occurred here, in Sydney and in Belgium, what that does is it sharpens the resolve. And I think in this case, the enormity of what happened in Paris, the numbers of the casualties, the sense now that it's happened twice in France, I believe that not only does it contribute to the resolve, but I think it's really sharpened it in many ways.
Right, and I should just remind the audience, that for people who haven't been here before, that the Halifax Chat is a 30-minute, pretty much quick-fire interview session. We may have time to bring in members of the audience, but don't feel disrespected if not. Unfortunately for you, I'll be chairing the next session, at which point I'll give every opportunity for people to ask questions. But to General Allen, I'm going to ask one of these questions that may be the bane of your life, but actually is your life. Can ISIL, Daesh, be defeated? And if so, how?
Sure, I absolutely believe it can be. I believe we're well on the way. We are going to fight this organization, and I said it, I think it was yesterday, in several different spheres. We're going to fight it in the physical sphere, where we measure our activities largely in military terms supported by stabilization operations. We're going to fight it in the financial sphere, because in that capacity, shrinking their resources, shrinking their access to the international financial system really reduces their options, their ability to operate. And then we're going to fight them in the information sphere. We've heard it called a number of things, but it is the information sphere. And it may not, there may not be a decisive defeat in all three of those spheres simultaneously. I believe that we'll have success in the physical sphere that'll be easily measurable. The financial sphere is beginning to pick up momentum, frankly. But the information sphere, we've got to do a better job contesting Daesh's messages in the information sphere. And it's really three things. It is contesting the message, having a superior message, and dealing with the platforms that give Daesh the capacity to project its message of hate and its recruiting message. And so, as I've said before, and I really do believe it, Daesh will not be dead as an entity until we have killed it in the information sphere, until we've killed the idea. And all of these things together is what will ultimately give us the capacity to defeat this organization.
And it's an interesting, even sort of philosophical question about whether the material developments influence ideas, or ideas are the ones that push forward with, material things. But when it comes down to the question of defeating ISIS, Daesh you prefer to call it, on the ground in Syria, Iraq, can you give a sense of how formidable a force they actually are, and perhaps with reference to comparisons to, I don't know, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was considered to be an enormous obstacle, but almost indefeatable according to many people for many years. What sort of, how many divisions has ISIL got?
Well, we don't know the numbers exactly. I've had a little experience with Al-Qaeda, so I believe I can, and the Taliban, so I believe I can draw a comparison. Daesh is substantially more capable than Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. It's more capable than Al-Qaeda by virtue of its capacity to organize, and it's the creation of an identity of the so-called caliphate. It's more formidable than the Taliban because the Taliban were, as difficult as they were to deal with, they were largely an Afghan movement, the Pashtun movement. But Daesh has not just created the capacity to operate in the physical sphere, but it also now has jumped the border, so to speak. And it has incorporated into its doctrine the distant provinces, because, of course, in the doctrine of the caliphate, it must be constantly expanding, must be in relentless war with the apostates, must be expanding in territory, must be expanding in the numbers of individuals and humans that it dominates and can subjugate. So when it gets squeezed in the core in Iraq and Syria, having the capacity to influence the situation in the provinces with an attack, say, in Europe, or an attack in the Sinai, or an attack in the North Caucasus province of Daesh, it still seems to be projecting its power. It still seems to be projecting its capability. And one thing I have to say is, in the invasion of Iraq in 2014, the actual combat power of Daesh was not that great. And I'm not dismissing it or diminishing it. The really profoundly capable use of information multiplied its combat power dramatically. We talk about combat multipliers and force multipliers. As they were streaming south out of Mosul, the images that were appearing in social media on the phones of many of the Iraqi troops who were in the next defensive line, of the crucifixion of Christians and the beheadings of prisoners and the mass executions of those who'd been taken prisoner, that in and of itself served in many respects as an information rolling barrage, a technical military term, but numbers of troops that broke and ran because they were receiving the message on the one hand of the atrocity which was awaiting them, and on the other hand the message from home saying, for God's sake, don't leave us. You've got to get here. And that began a sequence of events and a precipitation of retreat. And there's nothing quite as frightening as a rout when it starts. And they used information to begin that rout. And so their combat power wasn't that great. Competing with them in the information sphere is how we can reduce their force multiplying effect and then deal with them in the reality of the physical sphere.
I mean, it's an interesting point about, the multiplier effect of information.
Yes.
Because the objective reality is that after the attacks in Paris, when they killed 130 people, I think the latest death toll is, they projected enormous power in reality. I mean, they brought to a halt an entire country. One of the greatest cities in the Western world was brought to a standstill. Other Western capitals were brought to a standstill. And so in terms of their own ability to project power, and therefore in the information sphere to attract recruits precisely because they have this power, it isn't illusory, in fact, is it?
No, it's not. That's why we have to be as capable as possible in competing with them in the information sphere. As I said, it is there where in the competition of ideas where we will ultimately win this fight. We're going to defeat them physically. It just will be. And we'll see us piling on additional capabilities as time goes on, as the operational requirements will demand. But we must have a superior message to theirs, and it has to be a superior message that resonates with the target populations, and that's the Muslim population in the Middle East, or the Muslim population in Southeast Asia, or the Muslim population in the enclaves of Europe. And not one message fits all. It has to be carefully nuanced so that it will resonate with that population. As I think I said yesterday, King Abdullah in Jordan has been very clear, and he said that we must have an Arab face to the message and a Muslim voice. Happily, we believe we will have a messaging center which will be created soon in Southeast Asia. We think there will be one that will emerge in West Africa. The Emiratis very generously created a messaging center, the Sawab Center, the Right Path Center in Abu Dhabi, where we monitor social media, look for the trends, and then begin to compete in the digital sphere against it, or emphasizing or amplifying messages that we would seek to conduct. So a global network of messaging centers that is capable of nuancing a local message for the local population is an important advantage for us.
Right, and I'll come back to that point about ideal. It was a very interesting session. I don't know whether you were present this morning on modern Muslims.
Yes.
And you were present. A very interesting point about ideology, and I want to come back to that. But just staying for a second in the concrete question of the battle on the ground, is it possible to defeat Daesh without a ground invasion, without ground troops? And I know this again is something that you want to stop people from drawing simplistic ideas about what ground troops means, but please expand.
When we the coalition, sought to undertake the counteroffensive against Daesh, it was clearer for us then that we had options on the ground in Iraq that we didn't have in Syria. And frankly, the options that we have on the ground in Syria today, I could not have imagined, frankly, just 7 months ago. So we have real options on the ground in Syria now. But in Iraq, we were faced with making one of two decisions. And this is an oversimplification because there's nothing binary about this. But you can go big with Western forces and take Daesh head on with the intent ultimately of defeating it in detail with Western forces. If, however, you haven't developed the back end of that commitment, if you haven't developed the capacity for, once Daesh has been cleared, the establishment of security for the population through the recovery of police.
Is that the great lesson of Iraq?
Of course it is. Of course it is. Then the insertion, once again, of credible governance that the local population will recognize and be willing ultimately to submit to the judgment and leadership of that population. And then, very importantly, in the aftermath of this, is the stabilization effort. In fact, you can make the case that the defeat of Daesh is only partly about its physical defeat, the rescuing of the liberated populations, restoring essential services, taking care of the women and children who have been terribly abused by Daesh, getting the women and the children into the game, the women into the game as well as part of the solution. It's the stabilization piece of this, the back end, which takes quite a while. And so when you commit large numbers of Western ground forces into an environment like this, the chances are very good that you're going to create a lot of antibodies. And we've seen it before. I mean, I had to deal with it personally now in a couple of different theaters. Or you can make the other choice, which is that while it will take longer and while it will not necessarily be as pretty or smooth at the front end of it, empowering the indigenous force ultimately to be the defeat mechanism, the security mechanism, and the force which delivers stabilization and, in essence, recovers its own population and draws it into the writ of the government. That's a very powerful, ultimately a very powerful mechanism for the defeat of Daesh. And it's the long-term solution. So it's a balance between the two. It doesn't mean we have to go big here or we have to go big here. There will be a combination. And we're feeling our way through this. As time goes on, we may see additional forces coming in, probably special operations forces in a different way, maybe well forward, closely aligned with the Iraqi or the Kurdish forces that are maneuvering on the ground. You're already seeing us moving in that direction now. And it's not because necessarily that we think things are going badly. In fact, the reason you're seeing us actually contemplate application of greater and different kinds of force is because we think that we can achieve greater effect by applying that force at the right place and at the right time. We've gotten the physical environment to the point where instead of fighting individual battles with Daesh to stop their momentum or to achieve local effect, we have now contained it largely on the ground in Syria and Iraq, and the capacity now to pressure it around its periphery is what we're seeking to do. Force them to make decisions in all directions with limited resources, and as they do that, punish them in any one direction where they have lessened their capabilities. This is what we're pursuing now, and we may see us apply more force as time goes on to exploit a critical vulnerability that is opened up in this strategy.
Right, and coming back to the point about what you described as the back end, the sense of having something to offer some stability once the regime, well, if it was Iraq, the regime is gone, once ISIL is gone as a serious force in Syria and Iraq. Isn't the whole problem of the mess of Syria that if there's going to be a back end, then the most obvious one is through Bashar al-Assad? which has been pretty much ruled out by many of our Western leaders.
Well, I think I'd take issue with the comment that the most reasonable or serious back end would come through
the
Bashar.
most obvious, the most present. I mean, it's either going to be Assad or someone else. Well, if it's not Assad, who is that someone else? Since Assad is obviously not going to just walk away.
No, that's correct. Look, this is not about regime change. The external actors have now met several times. We're working very closely to try to determine which element of the Syrian opposition will move into the lead for the purposes of being a part of the conversation. And it doesn't mean that with Bashar and some close circle of compadres are moved off into the future through an electoral process or a democratic process, that the central government ultimately can't be a part of the stabilization. But for now, the central government doesn't control much of Syria, frankly. And so we have, I think, some pretty good work being done by members of the coalition working out of Turkey into northern Syria to try to do what can be done to provide humanitarian assistance and support to civil society to those aspects of the Syrian population that we can get to. But I will tell you that as we have thought about military operations in Syria, in other words, empowering Syrian forces to be the solution themselves, we're relatively confident that the military piece of this will take care of itself. But the most important thing from our perspective is the stabilization piece of this. When Daesh is removed, how do we secure the population? Who secures that population? How do we ensure that we have open lines of communication where we can move the kinds of humanitarian assistance that is necessary to rescue the population? The reality, of course, is that often the stabilization piece of a campaign like this is much more challenging than simply the physical defeat of the enemy on the ground. As I said, the defeat of Daesh is not the hardest part here. It is the rescuing of the population and bringing it back into the mainstream. And the state of the population of Syria is difficult to overstate the difficulties it's going through right now. The human misery, the displacement of the population, the humanitarian calamity that has occurred to these folks, it is hard to overstate how bad that is, and it's going to take a very long time in the stabilization piece. That's why the campaign to take back the ground has got to have a very robust capacity to provide for the essential services and the restoration of the security of the population.
There's a point that, which we talked about, perhaps following your analogy, the front end being the military part of it, the back end being the stabilization, the police forces, the hospitals, the basic services that people would need to have provided for them. Janice Stein, on the panel that you were on yesterday, raised a point that wasn't, I don't think, followed up on, or hasn't been so far followed up on in our other discussions strongly enough, and that is the other lesson from Iraq and also of Syria is, are these states, Iraq and Syria, actually viable anyway? And to what extent is that factoring into the long-term planning? Because, you can beat ISIL, you can establish potential policing operations in cities and regions and so on. But if that state, Syria, and that state, Iraq, are ultimately not viable because of inbuilt flaws going back 100 years,
sure,
then it'll all fall apart again, won't it?
It easily could. I'll tell you that very early in the process with respect to Iraq, we asked ourselves the question, and the Canadians will understand this immediately, do you skate to where the puck is, or do you skate to where the puck will be? In other words, do you anticipate that Iraq can't hold together and you now, in your efforts, seek to create that which makes sense given the political environment, or do you try initially to restore the status quo ante, the territorial integrity of Iraq, re-empowering ultimately the central government as your final goal, with the idea that if something else follows, then it should follow naturally through a political process. And for our purposes, we made the latter decision, which was to restore the territorial integrity of Iraq, because in essence, that country still had much intact of the institutions of government and therefore could, in fact, be reestablished. We would love to see that the succession of power in Damascus delivers into the hands of the Syrian people, credibly delivers into the hands of the Syrian people, both a political entity and a political process, which could go about the business of restoring Syria whole, unified, and secular. But it's difficult to envision right now because of the many different groups. Look, we've hardly heard in this conversation over the last day or so the term Jabhat al-Nusra. We've talked about Daesh, and we've talked about the regime, and we've talked about the Russians, but there is a huge elephant in the room every time we talk about these groups, and it's Jabhat al-Nusra. That's Al-Qaeda, and we're going to have to deal with them as well. So the idea of there being a relatively short-term outcome in Syria as compared to the outcome in timing for Iraq, they're not going to be similar. And we're going to have to do a lot more in terms of the clearing of discordant elements on the ground in Syria than probably we will in Iraq.
Well, that's worrying because Iraq is obviously something that's still ongoing in its own right anyway. But I just want to come back again to that point about the integrity of the state and bring in another war situation that occupied a lot of our attention during the 1990s, and that was the wars in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia. Well, one of the reasons, arguably, why it was able to be reasonably successful was because people recognized there's no way you can keep this state together. You know, if the only way you can keep, and I put to you as sort of a devil's advocate, not necessarily my own point of view, that Iraq can exist and Syria can exist as unified states, but only in a highly authoritarian situation, because the sectarian nature of those states, like Yugoslavia, although one needs to be careful of using European analogies and placing them in the Middle East, sure. It means that, you know, you can restore Iraq, you can restore Syria, you just can't make them proper democracies.
I don't think we know, but I think we have an obligation to try. There are representatives of many states in this room that where the state, we could have had this conversation about that state 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 70 years ago, that there was no hope for the state ever being a functioning democracy. And in mind I have our great friends and partners in East Asia, which ultimately emerged from either the ashes of war or emerged from years of corrupt governance, and were able to truly embrace a democratic system to create democratic institutions which ultimately served their population. It's hard to envision that right now in Iraq, or it's hard to envision that right now in Syria. But I believe we have absolute moral obligation to try to do that, and do that with everything we can bring to bear.
I am going to give a couple of minutes to the audience. We do have microphones ready, yes? Is there anybody who would like to ask a question? The gentleman there, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Josh Rogan. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg View in Washington. General Allen, thank you for your time today, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, there have been some articles written in the press, and can't always believe what we read in the press. Believe me, I know.
If you wrote it, John, I believe it.
Josh. But yes.
Oh, Josh.
Yes.
Sorry.
No
now I'm calibrated. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. That's maybe not good.
Next question, please.
The articles, a couple of which I did write, stated that while you were in the administration, you pushed for several measures to increase the U.S. activity against the Islamic State that were rejected by the White House. These included a safe zone that you negotiated at length with the Turkish government, that the White House ultimately didn't agree to, things in terms of airstrikes, more activity inside of Syria. How much of that is true? Where exactly did you disagree with the White House? You can tell us now. Thank you.
Next question. Josh, I think you know that we don't talk about internal conversations that we have, and I offered a number of options, and so we'll see how those ultimately play out. I will offer some clarity on the Turkish negotiations because we worked that very hard. The nature of those negotiations ultimately called for the closure of the last 98 kilometers from roughly the west bank of the Euphrates to Kilis. And we talked about how far we'd push Daesh off the border was unknown, but we determined that in the bilateral planning between the United States and Turkey in conjunction with our Arab Syrian partners. It was not intended to be a safe zone. What we agreed to was that should the conditions permit in the aftermath of the operation, that we would ultimately facilitate the return of refugees into that area. So we may have ultimately matured in our thinking to call it a safe zone and take the measures necessary to make it a safe zone, because I think there'd have to be not an insubstantial ground force that can control the boundaries of that zone and provide for security of the people inside the zone. But the actual negotiations called for the clearing of the border, clearing to a depth, and then, if the conditions permitted, the voluntary return, supported by us, the voluntary return of refugees. So thank you for that question.
The lady there. Yeah.
General Allen, I have two questions. First,
And make them very quick, please. Yep.
Daesh is operating based on the element of surprise. How is the fight going on? They are declaring now that the next targets will be Rome and Washington and Germany, so it means that they can operate somewhere else. This is my first question. The second one is, as you have a close eyes on Daesh, and they are coming close to the Israeli borders. I'm an Israeli. They don't mention Israel. Do you foresee that they have plans on Israel, against Israel? Thank you.
I am certain, although I've been out of the government now 7 days, which might be 7 years given the aftermath of our recent tragedies. I am certain that one of the outcomes will be a very close examination of our information exchange, our intelligence exchange between and among our partners. Because, as you certainly know, being an Israeli, one of the great abilities that you have had to defend yourselves and ultimately to provide for your security has been a very aggressive and a very capable external and internal intelligence service. For us, we've got to get ahead of Daesh and not be in the react mode, but be in the act mode, which is what I said yesterday with respect to perhaps expanding the way we look at the campaign, not just have it be locally, regionally based in Iraq and Syria, but consider that the broader campaign has to be against the network, bringing in both a more robust intelligence relationship, bringing in the ministries of interior, bringing in law enforcement, so that we're dealing with the network, which gives Daesh the capacity to be on the offensive and to go to those cities. So it's really a twofold effort. One is to ensure that our intelligence exchange, our intelligence fusion is sufficiently robust to detect our gaps and to try to cover down on those gaps in terms of our collection process. And the second is to ensure we've got all the right agencies of our partners actively involved in this campaign and not be focused solely on the core, but now begin to focus with real attention on the network so that we can interdict that network and prevent the Rome or another of our capitals. With respect to Israel, the fact that Daesh has not announced its intentions with regard to Israel doesn't mean, in fact, that Daesh doesn't have Israel square in its crosshairs, which is, frankly, as we think about how we prosecute the campaign, the security of Israel is, of course, part of our consideration with respect to the building of capacity in the region, resilience, and the ability of partners in the region to defend themselves, because their ability to defend themselves also works in an indirect and sometimes a direct way towards the security of Israel, and that's something that we think about all the time.
Thank you. Right, the final question, Camille Grand, please. 10-second question, 30-second answer.
Okay, Camille Grand from France. President Hollande has announced his intention to step up the campaign against Daesh in the Levant. What sort of military advice would you give him? What can we do more immediately in terms of targeting? Should we go much more after the oil revenues? What sort of advice? I know you don't want to go into another advising position to another president, but I definitely would be interested in your views on what we could do more immediately.
Sure. My guess is that President Hollande is getting some pretty good advice from his French leadership. We've done some very good analysis on the network associated with energy. We need to become even more aggressive in the targeting of that analysis. Everything from where it comes out of the ground to who makes the money when the tanker truck pulls up to the black marketeer. As you know, we are now attacking the tanker trucks. The tanker trucks were the connective tissue between the wellhead and the black market profiteer. Pick that up. I think that there is substantial capacity in the context of our special operations that can be brought to bear. Just as a reflection, back in May of last year, we did a direct action hit on the compound of Abu Sayyaf, chief financial officer of Daesh. We killed him and the others of the individuals that were in the meeting, but we took prisoner his wife, Sayyaf, and liberated a Yazidi slave. We also took 7 terabytes of information off that compound. We were attacking other targets within hours of the exploitation of that information. And what happens when you do the direct action against these compounds is you get prisoners, you get information that generates more targets, which generates more operations, and the tempo of special operations can become so great that you can gum up their capacity to make decisions. It creates great demoralization within the system of command. So if I were to go big fast with forces that can move fast and have effect relatively quickly, I would look within the coalition for combined joint special operations, direct action capabilities to start going after these leaders.
Well, thank you very much. I would have loved to have gone on for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, as long as it takes, but it's been a wonderful opportunity, General Allen. Thank you very much, and please join me. Thank you. Okay.